next speaker is Kathy Terry, who is currently a natural resource specialist for Wetland Reserve Enhancement Program in Area 1, and is going to be talking about a big project out in western Kentucky along the Mississippi and in the Alluvial Valley and a few other places too as well. So Kathy, if you're ready to take over, I'll let you.
Can you see my slides, Matt?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, here we go. So I'm going to talk about ACEP WRE. We tend to use a lot of acronyms in federal government, and I'll explain what they mean here in a minute. But first, I wanted to just kind of go over why the program exists. So there used to be a lot of wetlands, and now there's not. Back in the colonial time period, there were over 200 million acres of wetlands just in the lower 48, and now we've lost half of those just up to the 1980s. There were some legal wetland protections that came about. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to, to regulate wetland loss. But the one that affected the farmers most was the 1985 Farm Bill. There was swamp buster provisions in that Farm Bill that allowed for anything that was drained prior to December 23rd, 1985 could remain, and it's called a prior converted wetland. But anything after that, if they did that without wetland determination or any kind of permits, then they could lose their Farm Bill benefits, their USDA benefits. So that was a big deal, that date. This shows you the drainage for our agriculture. So each dot on this map represents 20,000 acres drained, and you can see where it's the Mississippi River floodplain all down through here. They've estimated that 87% of the losses from the 50s to the 70s were due to agricultural conversion. So that's why this program came about. In Kentucky, we've lost 81% of our wetlands. In the 80s, there are about 300,000 acres remaining out of 1.5 million that we had earlier. And then you may see this map again. People use it all the time. It's very good to show what the wetlands used to look like pre-settlement. You see the river drainages in the yellow were the wetland areas, and then all this forest land. And then it was converted to ag, which is this yellow-brown, and pasture, which is this. So you can just see real quick how it's been affected, the landscape. So what does ACEP WRE mean? So prior to 2014, it was called the Wetland Reserve Program, WRP. You may still call it that. People call it that all the time. So it's the same program. But in 2014, the Farm Bill consolidated all of the easement programs under the umbrella of ACEP, which is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And under that, we have our wetland reserve easements. We have agricultural land easements, which actually keep ag land from being developed. So that's popular around cities. Healthy Forest Reserve Program and the Grassland Reserve Easement Program, which are currently unfunded. The purpose of WRE is to restore those prior converted cropland acres back to wetlands. And as you are going to hear over and over, the value of wetlands include filtering sediments, nutrients, reducing flooding, recharging groundwater, providing habitat, things like that. And we did see whooping cranes on an easement in Henderson County in previous years. So that's pretty cool. Nationally, 2.8 million acres of wetland easements have been created since 1996 when the program started. So you compare that to over 100 million lost, it doesn't sound like that much, but it's a big deal. We're going in the right direction, trying to get some of these back. Statewide in Kentucky, we have 380 easements, and they cover over 50,000 acres across Kentucky. Western Kentucky has the most wetland easements, and you can see Fulton County by far has the greatest number of acres. And then Hickman County, Hopkins and Union, McCracken, Henderson. They are mostly along the big rivers and drainages in Kentucky. This map is a statewide view, and it shows you All the dots are easements, and these are not just wetland easements. So these here around Lexington are actually agricultural land easements that are protecting farms. A lot of them are horse farms from development. And then we have some healthy reserve forest easements over here, healthy forest program. And then I zoomed in on this one in more western Kentucky here, and you can see along the Ohio and Mississippi, Trade Water, Green River, and Clarks River, we've got easements everywhere. So the blue dots are the WRP, which is prior to 2014, and green dots, which is hard to make out, are the newer ones, 2014. Now pay attention to this area right here. I'm going to zoom into that. So Hickman, Kentucky is this city right here. And this is the Mississippi River. And this is one of the only areas in Mississippi that doesn't have a levee protecting this. So this area here we call the upper bottoms, and this gets flooded every year. Here's some national wetland inventory of forested wetlands that exist there. And then I just wanted to show you this, where we're purchasing easements in this area. All this red has been purchased. Right here is the Obion WMA, Laterno Woods, and the Shafe Tract. So we're adding protected wetlands, restoring wetlands in this area. It's very valuable. Here is a picture of where you drive out of Hickman. This is what it looks like in the winter. It's just all flooded. This tree here says it was 62 feet high in May of 2011. That was the highest that it got. This is typical in the wintertime down there in the upper bottoms. So that's pretty cool. What is an easement? So an easement is where the federal government purchases the management and development rights of this property. We pay the landowner a one-time fee, a one-time payment to purchase these rights. It's different than CRP, which they get annual payments. So the purpose is to restore those wetland functions. And the policy allows for permanent and 30-year easements. And though we have funded 30-year easements previously in Kentucky, we haven't in several years because we have plenty of applications for permanent, and you get much more bang for the buck with a permanent easement. So they are in perpetuity. The landowner signs a warranty easement deed at the very end of the process, and that gets recorded in the county courthouse, and it follows the land. So if it's sold, that deed stays with it. The easement stays with the land. They retain 5 rights when they sign this warranty easement deed, including title. So they own it, they can sell it, and they pay taxes on it. They have the right to quiet enjoyment, which just means that we're not going to go out there at all times of the year. You know, we're going to try to have low disturbance and let them know when we're going to be out there. The landowner has control of access. This is not public land, so they can put up a gate and keep people out. They can use it for recreational uses, undeveloped hunting, and they can have some hunting structures out there. And they retain the subsurface resources as well. So if they ever want to drill for natural gas, they can go. They can't use the easement to drill, but they can go underneath to obtain those minerals or gases that are under there. But there's a lot more prohibitions in the warranty easement deed than there are rights. So they can't hay it and mow it. They can't dump waste. They can't harvest timber. No more dredging, draining, diverting of water, building any structures, planting crops, grazing, livestock, disturbing nesting wildlife, or developed recreation. So it does take away a lot of what they can do with their land. The United States has management rights, so we can go in there and restore, protect, manage it, enhance it, monitor it, but we can prescribe compatible use authorizations back to the landowner to allow them to manage certain things, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We can access the easement with vehicles. That's one of our rights. We can delegate management to other federal and state agencies, and we can enforce some violations. There have been issues on easements, so just some examples of what might be a violation would be unauthorized timber harvest, dumping gravel or rock on the easement, having too many food plots, maybe digging a ditch or something like that. So the landowner may be responsible for costs associated with those to put it back the way it needed to be. I'm going to go over a little bit of how we acquire the easements. The timeline for acquisition includes obtaining an application from the landowner and ranking it, doing a site evaluation and scoring it, due diligence activities, and then once we receive our allocation, we make offers. Once they receive an offer, we do a survey of the easement boundary, and then it proceeds into closing. This process can take over 3 years from application to closing when they receive their money and sign that final deed. But if they don't receive an offer in any given year, their application just rolls over. So we have applications sitting in our filing cabinet from 2015 that haven't been funded just because they don't score well. So we do have a lot of applications on file. We take applications year round. There's no funding, there's no deadline like EQIP or CRP have, but we do have cutoff dates. So the state will set a date, and then all the applications we receive up to that date will be considered for funding in that fiscal year. Landowners must submit a copy of their deed. So they have to have owned it for at least 24 months before they can go into this program. And every landowner on the deed must sign the application so everybody knows what's going on. It's not binding and can be canceled at any time. The landowner has to be eligible to be able to participate in this program. So they must register their farm with the Farm Service Agency, and they have to fill out a lot of paperwork. Some of the things they have to fill out at FSA include a 941, which is their adjusted gross income. And they can't have made over $900,000 on as an average over the past 3 previous tax years. Those forms get sent to the IRS, and the IRS is responsible for making decisions on if they're compliant or not, and we look at that. They also have to certify that they have not converted wetlands on the property and submit a business plan. The land also has to be eligible, and like I said before, we're looking at prior converted wetlands. So we're looking at farmland. This is not a preservation program, it's a restoration program. So we want to restore large acres of farmland that was wetlands. So we look for hydric soils. First thing I do when I get an application is look at that drainage class and make sure it's poorly drained or somewhat poorly drained. We have people that try to put in an easement that they say, you know, is wet, but it doesn't have the right soils, so it just isn't eligible. It has to be capable of being restored. It has to be greater than 20 acres usually, and it can't be all chunked up. It has to be a good boundary. It has to have legal access from a public right-of-way. So that sometimes hangs people up. If they've been accessing their backfield across a neighbor for the last 40 years, but they've never had it legally recorded in the courthouse, you know, they may have to do some work to get that legal. And then we can't have hazardous materials nearby or on site. We go through a rigorous ranking process. We look at a lot of different criteria, including the size. Usually the bigger the better on these. Proximity to protected areas. So we look at nearby easements, WMAs, nature preserves, state parks, things like that, that have similar goals with their protected areas. We look at percent eligibility. This is important on the ranking. So for every acre of that hydric soil cropland that they put in, they're allowed to put in an acre of match, which would be woods or maybe some upland area. That's so that they can square up their farmland and put in a whole farm or tract. So we do get some woods in these easements that are already mature woods. But the more match they put in, the lower the percent eligible. So they lose a little bit of points on that. Proximity to large streams and rivers, threatened and endangered species. You know, the Indiana northern long-eared bat, they come up on the database on all of our easements. Sometimes we see the interior least tern and mussels along the big rivers. The relic darter along Bayou are some of the species that pop up on that database search. We look at wildlife corridors. how much adjacent forest land is there? Is it surrounded by a lot of forest already, which is good? Or is it like an island, going to be an island in a big desert of ag land? We look at if they've harvested timber in the last 3 years, if we can plant trees along streams. All these get more points for this application. Cropping history, and we do an on-site evaluation. Our team goes out there, we bring our engineers to take a look at this. We use LiDAR to look at drainage patterns and see where we can restore hydrology, maybe plug ditches, create small shallow water areas, and break a levee if we need to, break tile if there's tile drainage. Those are some examples of how we restore them. So all of this gets wrapped up into a score. We also have to do a variety of due diligence practices. We order a title exam, and these reports come up with all of the claims on the land in the past 60 years. Could be oil and gas leases. It could be off conveyances that have been sold. It could be an easement sold to a neighbor 40 years ago to access their property in the back. It could be anything that comes up on these title exams. Environmental database inquiries. So we contract with a company that does this and look at any kind of nearby hazardous effects. It might be Superfund site or cleanups that have been in the area. And then our team does hazardous materials inspections when we go out there. We interview the landowner. We look for discoloration in the soil, vegetation, the water, places where they may have buried something, old house sites where there might be an old septic or a cistern. And we do certificates of inspection and possession. So they take this very seriously. We want to make sure that we're not buying an easement on something that shouldn't become an easement. To value this land, a lot of times NRCS will do what's called an area-wide market analysis with an appraiser and come up with county by county numbers. You may have heard of our GARC values. So that's helpful, where we can tell a landowner right up front what they're going to get for their easement based on how much cropland and how much wood acres are going to go in. But the last couple of years, we've been doing individual appraisals on the higher scoring easement properties that may get an offer. So after the appraisal's done, the landowner can look at the value and decide if they want to go forward or not. NRCS pays 95% of fair market value for these easements. If they decide they want to go forward, we have funding. The next thing that happens is that we make an offer. So the high scoring easements, they sign an agreement to purchase. After everybody signs this agreement, this encumbers the money, so it's not spent on anything else. And then a legal survey is contracted with a certified surveyor, and they post the boundary with these signs. You may have seen these green signs. I think they're white now. And they pin them, so we have a permanent as you can get, with a long rebar down in the ground of where the boundary is. After everybody agrees on this surveyed boundary, then the whole package goes off for 18 months. It sits on desks of our legal team in Atlanta, Office of General Counsel. It goes through internal controls where they look at everything we've done and ask questions and make sure that we've done everything right. There's final title policies, and after all that, 2 years later, they finally sign the final deed and get their money. Once it becomes an easement, then we must do a cultural resource investigation. So before we can do any restoration, we need to make sure that there's not any significant areas that need to be protected based on this investigation. So our archaeologist hires a firm to go out there, and they'll either walk it if it's disc and look for these. They'll do shovel testing, they'll dig trenches, and they'll look for artifacts. It can be historic or prehistoric even. And sometimes they'll come back with areas we need to avoid. And usually they're small areas, so it doesn't really affect the entire easement. It could be a little mound that they find, or an area that needs to be avoided. We can't do restoration on those areas. So most of the time they're just left to grow up naturally. After that is done, what usually happens is tree planting. So we contract with tree planter contractors, and they can hand plant. So these are hand planters going out there with the trees on their back, and they have a double bar, and they stick the trees in the ground. Or we have tree setters on tractors that go out, and these are the furrows that they plant their trees in. We plant 435 trees to the acre, and they're in 10 by 10 spacing. It's a variety of bottomland hardwood oaks that like water, and we have hickories, pecans, cypress trees, persimmons, dogwood, silky dogwood, wildlife trees. And as you may guess, after we plant the trees, the soft-seeded species will come in and colonize as well. So these tree planting areas look really messy after a few years with the sycamore and cottonwood, ash, maple, willow all coming in and colonizing, but that's just, we let it go. It's wildlife habitat. After we plant the trees, we construct hydrology. And like I said, some of the things we do stream crossings, tile breaks. We can build embankments to hold shallow water. And our water levels are usually 6 to 18 inches deep, so they are shallow. This is a water control structure that has boards in it that the landowner could manipulate to keep the water levels appropriate for wildlife. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. So that usually happens in the fall. And then once the easement is restored, then it needs to be managed. Some landowners do not do any management, and that's okay. But some of them want to manage their easement. And so we give them what's called a compatible use authorization. Some examples would be planting small areas of food plots. We allow up to 5% of the easement to be planted in food plots, but they need to be mapped out. And there's restrictions on that. This is at NRCS discretion. They are also allowed to have temporary and rustic hunting structures that there's some size restrictions. And this is shallow water area. So like I was saying, we like them to drain that out in the summer, let it dry out, and then start flooding it back up in the late fall, winter to hold water for shorebirds and wildlife and waterfowl. Other compatible use authorizations are mowing access roads so we can get around it. They can get around it, but they're not allowed to use gravel on those roads. They mow their levees. Sometimes there's native grass that's been planted, so they can manage that. We also may allow some early succession habitat management to keep woody species from coming into areas that want to be kept open. But majority of the easement is planted to bottomland hardwood trees. So another thing we have to do is monitor our easements. Once a year, we're supposed to go out and look at on-site review all of the easements. Now they do go through kind of a timeline. So once they're restored, we need to do on-site monitoring for 3 to 5 years, and then they go into an off-site monitoring for a couple of years where we can look at current aerial imagery. So this is a heavy workload for our field staff, but our state office has started allowing contracting with drone operators, and this is considered on-site monitoring. And this is an example of the imagery we get back. So they go out there and they fly their drone and give us imagery. And we can see where there's food plots and the roads and the shallow water areas in here and make sure that they align with the compatible use authorizations. So that's been so helpful for our staff to be able to have this to help us with monitoring. We do go out with the landowners when they request us to go look at the easement. We go out and look when we have, we have sometimes a neighbor complain of flooding caused by beavers or some issues. So we're always going out to the easements, but this monitoring with drone has helped a lot. Let's see. I do want to talk about the REP real quick. So we partner with the Nature Conservancy. The REP is a wetland reserve easement partnership, and it's a special emphasis area. So this boundary encompasses the Mayfield Creek drainage, the Obion Creek drainage, and the Bayou de Shea. And it goes over into Graves County, a little bit of McCracken, Ballard, Carlisle, Hickman, Fulton County. We have had REP special area projects starting in 2011, I believe there's been 3 iterations of this. And what it is a special pot of money that comes to the state for applications in this area to try to increase easements in this area. And this is the upper bottoms that I showed you in the beginning down in here. So these landowners in this area just compete with each other. So it's just an extra way for us to get more easements on the ground, and it's very helpful. We do have a lot of partnerships, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, and our soil conservation districts. They help us with staffing, and the Nature Conservancy helps us with contracting. So we do utilize a lot of partnerships and very grateful for them. Our staff consists of people, Reed, Alan, Matt, and Jacob are up in Lexington. And then we have our field staff, Brandon, Jason, Brianna, and we're hiring another farm bill biologist out here in the field. And I would be remiss not to talk about Donna, Ray, Carl, and Doug, who many of you may know, who were instrumental in all these acres that I've shown you that we have in Kentucky. This program has been very successful. The landowners love it. It's popular. I see it being funded in the Farm Bill for years to come, and it's very rewarding to work on this program because you can definitely see the results of what you're working on. We do have fun out there. We do get stuck. We do play with snakes. That's Shelly and Carl getting stuck and playing with snakes. But anyway, that's my presentation. I will take questions.